The German Luftwaffe in the West was a neglected, broken tool. Here was the main reason for the German defeat on the invasion front. But does this mean that the Luftwaffe command can therefore be exempted from all responsibility? Was there no opportunity for improvisation? We have before us another report of the Luftwaffe command, compiled from the most important operation logs, accounts of experience and analyses. This attaches much importance to the German failure to carry out large-scale aerial mining of the sea along the invasion coast. It says, "It has been shown in both world wars that close mine barrages, even in the open sea, restrict the operations of naval forces and the movements of shipping, diverting them into definite areas." In the Second World War, minefields planted from the air outside ports and inlets proved to be even more effective obstacles to the enemy, entailing a considerable effort in terms of mine clearance. It may therefore be safely assumed that a large-scale strategic and tactical program of mine infestation from the air would have been a considerable deterrent to an invading enemy. Our weak air forces, in particular, could have given considerable support in this way to our defensive forces at the moment of invasion. Mining of approaches would have had to be done as a strategic measure. It would have needed to have been applied over a considerable period in all areas where the enemy might have been expected, or where coastal defences and troop concentrations were less strong. A thick mine barrage would have greatly interfered with the movement of transports and warships. The accurate intervention of Allied battleships in the ground fighting around Caen would have been made considerably less effective, and the defence generally, as well as the preparations for a counterattack, would have been greatly facilitated. The report finally points out that the sweeping of a close mine barrage laid from the air, which would have required a considerable effort by Allied naval units, would, moreover, have been an important indication of where the main blow of the invasion might be expected. The Luftwaffe command failed to grasp this task. Thus, while it may have been the innocent victim of a mistaken and inadequate defence policy, it must nevertheless be found guilty of a great many mistakes of its own. But then, in war, misfortune frequently becomes guilt, just as honour and glory are often no more than a free bonus of good fortune. The battle for Cherbourg Operation Heinrich, where Major Friedrich Wilhelm Kuppers, the commander of Artillery Group Montebourg, had his battle headquarters, was well camouflaged. The date was June 19. Kuppers was sitting on a stool in his well-camouflaged tent, his map table and artillery board on his knees. The Americans had brought up 4 divisions to force their breakout from the Utah bridgehead to the north and west. Kuppers glanced up as the flap of his headquarters tent was pushed aside. In the opening, haggard from lack of sleep, smeared with blood and dirt, stood Lieutenant Stock of the 5th Battery, 1262nd Army Coastal Artillery Regiment. He had come from the observation post on Hill 117. Kuppers was prepared for bad news. "What's up, Stake? Just look at yourself." In spite of his wound, Lieutenant Stock made a precise report. The enemy tank attack at the level crossing was stopped by our gunfire, but the Americans then made a surprise thrust along a sunken lane right into the little wood of Montebourg. Armoured units are pushing past the town centre on both sides. The infantry, which followed in their wake, is now being engaged in fierce fighting by the Grenadiers of Combat Group Berg, which is holding the town centre, and by units of Combat Group Hoffmann. "Things are looking ugly," Stock concluded his report. Then he added, "If we are lucky, the penetration can be sealed off. Otherwise, we're in the trap. We'll have to get out of here, Herr Major, or else we'll be bagged by the Americans." Major Kuppers regarded his lieutenant. He's right, of course, he thought. But Quineville-Montebourg, Gorse Hill, was the last position barring the road to Cherbourg, which had no proper landward defences. Once that position was breached, there would be no hope for Cherbourg. That was why, for several days running now, every order had insisted, if Montebourg falls, the road to Cherbourg will be open. Montebourg must be held. Mentally, Kuppers reviewed the past 8 days. On June 12, he had assumed command of the newly organised artillery group formed for the defence of Montebourg from 5 batteries of different artillery units. Its 19 guns included 4 122mm guns, 2 105mm guns, and 1 150mm self-propelled gun. Together with Flak Group Koenig and with Major Rassner's batteries of 100th Mortar Regiment, it represented a considerable firepower. Its purpose was to give support to 919th Grenadier Regiment, which had been in action ever since June 6 and had now been forced back to the edge of Montebourg, and to the combat groups Hoffmann and Müller of 243rd Infantry Division. The battle for Cherbourg had thus in fact begun, for a naval port or any fortress must be defended in the forefield. This lesson was borne out by every single landing operation from North Africa to Sicily and Italy, and it had been proved even earlier by the fall of Singapore. But the artillery commanders had waited in vain for the guns which were not needed in the west and north of the Cotentin Peninsula to be switched to its eastern coast so that the American bridgehead could be hammered and smashed by concentrated fire. But Guderian's slogan, not driblets, but mass, was being disregarded in the artillery too. Available resources were scattered about in driblets. The fear of further Allied landings, a fear nurtured by the German High Command and now haunting many headquarters, resulted in half measures or less than half measures. One battery would be sent to one place, and a couple of guns to another, to oppose enemy armour. At Montebourg, at long last, things were to be different. Here the German units containing the Utah bridgehead, units locked in exceedingly hard fighting, were to be given a really solid artillery backing. This backing was to be provided by Kupper's group, and indeed its batteries were firing to capacity. The Americans were beating their heads against the wall of Montebourg, the gorse hill of La Pernelle, and Quinville. During the day, Kuppers maintained what he called cunning fire, highly concentrated fire of very short duration, so as to make things difficult for the enemy's aerial spotting, sound ranging, and muzzle flash observation. At night, he laid on sprinkling fire, a kind of harassing fire with all guns firing simultaneously as a concentrated salvo, but each gun at its own separate pinpoint target. This method yielded good returns, both materially and psychologically. The Americans were nervously probing the whole neighbourhood with artillery and naval guns. Spotter aircraft were continually flying to and fro over the lines of the combat groups and their hinterland. The moment they spotted anything that looked like a gun position hell was at once let loose, but the gunners had become experts at camouflage. The gun positions were real masterpieces of blending into the background. Any artilleryman vastly prefers a well-camouflaged mobile field position to a static pillbox. Those blocks of concrete only limited one's field of fire. They could not really be concealed. They were ready-made conspicuous targets, and at the same time did not provide complete protection against bombs or naval guns. They were, in fact, coffins for the guns and their crews. The artillerymen in the field positions lay in one-man foxholes, just like the grenadiers of combat groups Müller, Keil, Berg, and Hoffmann in the main line farther forward. Thus, even the heaviest bombardments could survive. To do any damage, a shell would have to strike right into a foxhole, and that happened very rarely. After all, a one-man foxhole was very small, and what was more, it was almost completely invisible from the air. During the day, everybody remained under cover. Supplies, spares, ammunition, food. All these came up at night. The men became experienced night walkers. This cooperation between infantry combat groups and concentrated artillery, directed in a modern manner, proved exceedingly successful at Montebourg. Although the enemy was attacking with 3 divisions, the line held and the coastal roads to the north and northwest remained barred. Farther south, however, things went wrong. Major Kuppers recalled the dramatic telephone conversations he had had on June 16 and 17 with his regimental commander, Colonel Reiter, on whose staff was also Lieutenant Professor Walter Hallstein, now the chairman of the European Economic Community. The Americans have broken out to the west from their bridgehead, Reiter had told him. It was quite true. With 2 divisions, Major General Collins had thrust to the west, traversed the picturesque Douve Valley, crossed the river, and captured the battered little town of Saint-Sauveur-le-Vicomte. An important bridgehead had thus been established, but worse was to follow. General Helmick's combat group, with the 77th Infantry Division newly brought up from Brittany, was unable to halt the Americans' breakout from their beach or to iron out their new bridgehead. The 9th United States Infantry Division and units of the 82nd United States Airborne Division were pressing towards the western coast in an attempt to cut the Cotentin Peninsula in half, split up the German forces there, and cut Cherbourg's overland communications to the south. General Collins's manoeuvres succeeded. The Americans reached the western coast at Barneville. Thus, an American corridor had been established in the forefield of Cherbourg, running across the peninsula, and compelling the German forces of 84th Corps to establish a northern and southern defensive front. One operation that stands out from the general disaster of the collapse of the German defensive front west of Utah Beach is the 77th German Infantry Division's breakthrough to the south, right across the American line. Units of this division, under General Stegmann, were to have covered the right flank of Schlieben's Cherbourg front. However, 84th Corps realized that the main danger was in the south. Schlieben had just been discussing the details with Stegmann in the afternoon of June 17 when the order came through: disengagement towards the south. Stegmann was not sorry. He did not believe that Cherbourg's landward front could possibly be held by exhausted troops. Nor did he think very much of the idea of falling back on Cherbourg, which, in his opinion, was not tenable as a fortress in the long run. He was perfectly right. General Stegmann therefore tried to lead his division to the south as fast as possible, in battle-worthy groups, through the enemy front. However, the horse-drawn units of the division were intercepted by fighter bombers near the village of Brickbeck in the early morning of June 18. There was terrible confusion. Stegmann was driving down the road, trying to bring order into the chaos. Just then, a fighter bomber whooped down and opened fire on the general's car. The 20mm shells tore straight into the vehicle. The general was killed instantly, the fourth general to be killed in action on the invasion front. On the day before, General Helmich, the commander of 243rd Infantry Division, had lost his life in similar circumstances. He too had been struck and instantly killed by a 20mm shell. Death by fighter bomber was what the men called it in the front line. General of Artillery Marx, the exemplary and popular commander of 84th Corps, had also bled to death in a roadside ditch west of Saint-Lô on June 12, after being shot up by a fighter bomber. Command of 77th Infantry Division was taken over by the division's senior regimental commander, Colonel Batcherer, officer commanding 1049th Infantry Regiment. He summoned the unit commanders to a conference. What's to be done? Give up, some suggested. Fall back to the north, into Cherbourg Fortress, advised others. But Batcherer asked, are 1,500 to 2,000 men to go into captivity at a time when, down in the south, every rifle is needed for the establishment of a new line of resistance? The columns moved off during the night of June 18 and 19. They were making for the south. Captain Dr. Schreihager, the intelligence officer, gives the following account of the phantom march of the 77th through the American front. The few Volkswagens and radio vans that were still intact sneaked through the enemy lines in dread secrecy. In the grey light of dawn, the marching columns were passing through enemy-occupied villages. The American sentries got quite a fright when they saw the silent processions, and were quickly disarmed. They joined the marching columns as prisoners. Keep moving. The signals detachment dismantled and neatly coiled up the wires of American telephone connections, partly to cut the enemy's communications and partly to help themselves to badly needed material. A thick cloud cover and fine drizzle provided protection against fighter bombers. Towards 11 a.m. the force camped in a sunken lane. Patrols sent out to reconnoitre the immediate neighbourhood discovered an American field encampment less than 500 yards away, but the men simply could not march another step. It had to be risked. Not a sound, was the order. Rest for sleeping. The men dropped in their tracks. On the banks of the sunken lane sentries lay on the ground, their eyes glued to binoculars. Would the Americans spot them? They did not. In the late afternoon they moved on. Colonel Batcherer had a radio signal sent to the units of 243rd Division lying to the south, beyond the American corridor. We are pushing towards Viot. Let us pass through your blocking position. Can you help us by counterattack? Presently a handful of self-propelled guns of 243rd Division punched a clear passage through Villars for the 77th. But when they got to the little river Hollande, it looked as if all their efforts had been in vain. The crossings were blocked by a strong American position. Batcherer was not going to give up with success almost in sight. Now they would have to fight for it. The 1st Battalion, 1050th Infantry Regiment, charged against the enemy-held bridgehead in the old-fashioned manner, with fixed bayonets under cover of a light machine gun. They took the bridge, smashed the 2nd Battalion, 47th United States Infantry Regiment, and took a large number of prisoners. With all their wounded, with 250 prisoners, and with 12 captured jeeps, the regiments reached the German lines. All this, of course, Major of Artillery Friedrich Wilhelm Küppers, in his well-camouflaged hog-pen north of Montabaur, did not yet know on the morning of June 19, but he did know that the Montabaur sector was hanging in the air. And a sector was not just a stretch of land, but the grenadiers of combat groups Hoffmann, Kiel and Müller in their forward foxholes, the 19 guns of his 5 batteries and the guns of 30th Flak Regiment, Major Rassner's mortars, and the anti-tank troops of the 709th Panzerjägers under Captain Hummerich. This entire force was, in German army parlance, hanging in the air. Its flanks were unprotected, and it was apt to be bagged by the enemy at any moment. Küppers knew that Lieutenant Starker, standing in front of him, was quite right when he said, "We've got to get out of here, Herr Major. We're in a trap." Küppers called for his driver, Corporal Johann Koch. "Have we got any brandy left for the lieutenant?" "He's earned a drink." Koch produced a bottle. There was about 2 fingers left in it. The aluminum beaker would have to do for a glass. "Thank you, Herr Mauer." Starker smiled. He raised his stubbly chin and knocked back the drink. "Has Operation Heinrich not yet been ordered, Herr Major?" he asked. "No, our orders are to hold out." Operation Heinrich was the secret code name for the withdrawal into the fortified area of Cherbourg. Once the Americans had broken through at Saint-Sauveur and pushed across to the western coast of the Cotentin Peninsula, Schlieben's right wing was no longer covered. 7th Army therefore planned to withdraw these forces to the landward front of Cherbourg. Unless this was done, there was a danger that the Americans might swing north from the western coast, cutting off those of Schlieben's forces which stood at Montabaur. To avert this danger, and also to keep the initiative, a gradual withdrawal was to be carried out sector by sector upon the Q Heinrich. But when the Führer's headquarters learnt of the plan, Hitler flew into a rage and strictly forbade any withdrawal whatever. "The present positions are to be held at all costs," was the familiar order, but reality proved stronger at any rate. Schlieben's front had already been torn open to the west, so there was nothing left to hold. Rommel had remonstrated with Rundstedt by telephone, and Rundstedt had explained to Hitler the gravity of the situation. Thereupon his decision had been amended. The fortress of Cherbourg is to be held at all costs. A fighting withdrawal of units to the south of it is authorized provided the enemy's advance is slowed down. Withdrawal in one single movement is forbidden. The officers commanding the smaller units were suitably instructed. Now their responsibility was weighing heavily upon them, for, translated into the plain language of the fighting front, the order demanded, "Hold out until further resistance is impossible. Only then, at the very last moment, may you withdraw under irresistible enemy pressure to avoid capture." But when was this last moment? How would they recognize it if they had no idea of the situation on the next sector? To meet the local conditions and to clarify chains of command, the German forces were reorganized. The 709th Division and the 922nd Grenadier Regiment of 243rd Division were formed into a battle group Cherbourg and taken out of 84th Corps. Thus, responsibility for the Cherbourg area rested entirely with General von Schlieben. In his account of his anxieties, he says, "I remember fairly accurately a signal sent to me by Field Marshal Rommel, and it certainly did not suffer from any dearth of suggestions. Roughly it ran like this. Schlieben's group will hold out in front. It will retire only under heavy enemy pressure. It will not allow the enemy to outflank it. It will deceive the enemy by resourceful operations, and it will reach the landward front in good time." Yet all I had was an entirely battered division, with horse-drawn transport and almost immobile, while the enemy was far better and more generously motorized than even our armored formations were at the beginning of the Russian campaign. The enemy, moreover, had an air force which prevented all movement during daytime. Another order, Schlieben's account continues, pointed out that in accordance with latest orders from Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the line Saint-Vaast-de-la-Hague-le-Tail landward front of Cherbourg-Vauville had to be held at any price. This meant a barrier across the entire northern half of the peninsula. Yet another radioed signal demanded that not only the landward front, but the Joburg Peninsula in the northwestern corner had also to be held at all costs. The same demand was moreover made with regard to the hills at Brix. I had the impression that the High Command had stopped using a map or dividers. The road network on the Cotentin Peninsula was so extensive and so superbly engineered that a mobile motorized force could quite easily bypass any local opposition. On paper, I had been given a free hand, but in reality, orders were piling in one on top of another. Thus, it came about that because of this kind of hold on order, the grenadiers and artillerymen were still lying in their foxholes in the Montebourg area on June 19, although on the western side of the peninsula, American tanks were already moving towards Cherbourg. Let us return again to Major Cuppers in his hog pen north of Montebourg. Cuppers picked up the telephone and talked to the combat group headquarters. "First, we've got to seal off the penetration," was their opinion. "Otherwise, we're dished." Cuppers therefore commanded, "Concentrated fire on the various penetration points." The batteries started roaring. Rassner's mortars started lobbing their salvos. And a miracle happened. The artillery bombardment and the mortar salvos made the Americans hesitate. They suspected stronger forces than were in fact available, and they shrank from the risk of pushing on. But how long could they be fooled? Towards midday, a telephone connection with division was restored by mere chance. While mending a line severed by gunfire, the signallers had come across the wire leading to General von Schlieben's headquarters. Major Forster, the intelligence officer of Schlieben's 709th Division, was startled. "You're still there? We thought you'd moved back during the night." At that point, the line was cut again. Half an hour later, an avalanche of bad news began to pour into Cuppers's headquarters. The catastrophe was beginning to take shape. Captain Hummerich's unit of Panzerjägers had lost so many anti-tank guns that the right flank could no longer be protected. Lieutenant Koenig, the liaison officer with 30th Flak Regiment, reported that the gun emplacements were all noticing the approaching noise of battle and finding themselves under fire from mortars and tanks. Lieutenant Storrs, commanding the 1st Battery, 1709th Artillery Regiment, reported from his observation post on top of the Huberville Church Tower, "American armoured units are forming up for attack on both sides of Montebourg." The 4th United States Division thrust into the open right flank of the German positions, while the 79th Division advanced towards Montebourg, its tanks bypassing the town centre and reaching the roads to Valognes. Again, Major Cuppers rang through to the commanders of those combat groups to whom he had still a line. Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann, Major Rassner, and Lieutenant Schmidt had just turned up at his hog pen. They had been shelled out of their headquarters north of the Montebourg-Valognes road. What was to be done? Should they allow their flank to be rolled up and themselves to be cut to pieces? And should they surrender? Or should they retreat, which meant that they would be at the mercy of the fighter bombers? The heavens were merciful. A gale-force wind sprang up, driving low cloud before it. A fine drizzle began to fall. This was the kind of weather they needed. Here was a chance of escape from their trap. Once more their guns thundered and their mortars screamed. The ammunition they could not take with them was used up against the penetration points, simulating a counter-attack. This ruse enabled the combat groups to detach themselves from the enemy unnoticed. The difficult operation was brought off. Even the grenadiers in the town centre pulled out unnoticed. In accordance with orders, no withdrawal into the fortress in one movement was carried out, but an intermediate line was taken up in the Le Mans area. At 6:30 p.m. the combat groups were again in position, their guns ready for action. Only a soldier who has experienced for himself the kind of continuous fighting undergone by these men can appreciate the degree of discipline, obedience and courage implied in the simple phrase, "again in position." On the following day, the combat groups of Montebourg were incorporated in the landward defences of Cherbourg. The curtain was going up on the last act. Führer's orders. Resistance to the last round. Some of the battalions moving into strong points along the landward front of Cherbourg had been reduced to 90 to 180 men. If only they still had their heavy anti-aircraft guns which had proved so effective against tanks. But the guns, including a good many 88mm ones, had been left behind in their positions. As bad luck would have it, the gun limbers and tractors had been concentrated right in the middle of the American parachutists' dropping zone in the area of Saint-Mère-Église. The flak officer responsible had simply abandoned the tractor depot and disengaged himself. The result was disastrous. The 4 weakened combat groups had to defend a 30-mile around Cherbourg against 6 attacking divisions, in ordinary field positions, and with practically no armour-piercing weapons. The Joburg Peninsula, with its outer strongpoint Westeck, was held by 922nd Grenadier Regiment, organised as a combat group. Next, as far as strongpoint 463, came the combat group Kale, with 919th Grenadier Regiment and the 17th Machine Gun Battalion. The centre of the line was held by 739th Grenadier Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Cone, and the eastern sector, from strongpoint 436 down to Cap Levy, was manned by the combat group Rohrbach, together with 729th Grenadier Regiment. The nerve centre of the town's defences and of the landward front was in an underground command post at Octeville, a suburb of Cherbourg. There too was the headquarters of Admiral Henneker, the naval commander Normandy. General von Schlieben realised that there was no hope of prolonged resistance against a modern motorised army. The important thing was to gain time, and time to destroy the harbour so as to make it useless for American unloading operations for a long while to come. Time to enable a German defensive line to be established in the south so as to tie down the enemy forces aiming at Cherbourg for as long as possible. Schlieben spoke frankly to the commanders of his combat groups. Dig in and hold was the slogan for the strongpoints. The men did their best. In the corridors of the underground command headquarters, there was hardly room enough to swing a cat. Nearly 1,000 men were now inhabiting the subterranean galleries, sitting or lying around, stretched out on cases, kit bags and ammunition boxes, sleeping, dozing or cursing irritably. Naval gunners, the crews of harbour patrol boats, building workers of the Todt organisation, men of the Labour Service and Luftwaffe ground staff. There was a stench of gunpowder, rotting cloth, exhaust fumes from the various motors, and human sweat. The air conditioning system was no longer working. From the gallery exits came the crash of shell bursts. Now and again the electric light would flicker, and a moment later there would be an explosion. A corporal who had found safety in the command bunker but an hour ago, after his position had been overrun, knew what the bangs were. The Americans had reached the top of the hill above the command post. They were now using enormous drilling rigs to bore holes into the ground and were filling them with explosive. "If we don't surrender soon, they'll turn us into pulp," he observed challengingly. Sub-Lieutenant Bloom, Admiral Henneker's orderly officer, was laboriously picking his way to the Situation Room. The situation, of course, was revealed more clearly by conditions within the command post than on the maps. The troops hardly bothered to move their legs out of the way to let the sub-lieutenant pass. That was the measure of their weariness, their battle fatigue, but also their demoralization and recalcitrance. Bloom no longer paid any attention to it. He had just been to the general's command post. His chief of operations had told him enough. There was no hope. In the Situation Room, Bloom was met by Lieutenant Shearhorn, Henneker's aide-de-camp. "What news?" he asked. Bloom shrugged his shoulders. Fort du Roule fell 2 hours ago, so now the Americans on the high ground at the southern edge of the town command every corner of the fortress. Shearhorn was shocked. What happened? How could a powerful fort like that fall? Surely that rock fortress with its 150mm guns was considered impregnable. Bloom again shrugged his shoulders. The Americans had positioned their guns near a field hospital. With his batteries built into the rock and pointing seaward towards the harbour, the commander of the fort could not do anything useful anyway, and he dared not use his automatic weapons for fear of shooting up the hospital. His guns were silenced at point-blank range by hits through the apertures. Shearhorn walked up to the map. "And how long can we hold out in here?" Bloom answered without hesitation. "They've already encircled our hill. They're blocking the southern exit by blasting and are drilling down into the rock above us from the top. They are also dropping assault charges down our ventilation shafts. These may not hurt us much, but since the air conditioning has packed up, it means that our air is being fouled by nitrous fumes. If they don't blast us out of our burrow, they'll smoke us out." The sub-lieutenant fell silent. The aide-de-camp was silent too. The rumbling of the artillery sounded eerie and evil in this 20th century dungeon. Bloom reached under his desk. "That's the last of it," he said as he poured out 2 glasses of cognac. Divided from Bloom's Situation Room by only a few feet of rock and soil, Lieutenant General von Schlieben, the commander of the fortress of Cherbourg and the entire Cherbourg front, was likewise standing in front of his map in his panel room, gazing at the tangle of blue lines and red arrows. The date was Sunday, June 25, and the time was 3:52 p.m. There was a knock at the door. Major Forster, the Chief of Operations, entered. In his hand was a slip of paper. Army Group's reply to our signal, Herr General. Schlieffen turned. He said nothing, but his eyes tried to read in Forster's face the decision taken by Army Group in response to the signal he had sent that morning. Enemy superiority in material and enemy domination of the air overwhelming. Most of our own batteries out of ammunition or smashed. Troops badly exhausted, confined to narrowest space, their backs against the sea, harbour and all other important installations effectively destroyed. Loss of the town unavoidable in nearest future as enemy has already penetrated outskirts. Have 2,000 wounded without possibility of moving them. Is there any point, in view of the overall situation, in having our remaining forces entirely wiped out, as seems inevitable in the absence of effective counter-weapons? Request urgent instructions. Schlieffen remembered every word, especially the final question. He had taken some care with Forster to phrase it. Surely they must give him a free hand. Well, he asked, what's their reply? Major Forster read out. In accordance with the Führer's orders, you are to continue fighting to the last round. Rommel, Field Marshal, is that all? That is all, Herr General? The General glanced at the situation map on the wall. He had stared 100 times at the jumble of lines and arrows, and 100 times he had realized the basic fact that the fortress of Cherbourg had its face to the sea. That was the direction in which all the guns of the naval defences, of the army coastal artillery and of the fortress artillery were facing. That was the direction from which the enemy had been expected that he might come from behind, from the landward side, had been steadfastly and confidently discounted by the senior German command, in spite of many a warning. They were now about to pay for their mistake. The fate suffered in 1942 by the British in Singapore, the world's strongest naval fortress, was about to befall the Germans at Cherbourg, invasion through the back door. Major Forster and the intelligence officer were entering the latest reports about enemy penetrations on the situation map. Everywhere the red arrows were piercing the blue lines and circles of the German defensive positions, and every intersection by a red arrow represented a tragedy. Many of the strong points and defensive positions were not even connected by telephone. Neighbouring strong points often lacked visual contact with one another over the difficult ground. The ring of interior forts around the city centre were outmoded. Only the two newly built outer fortifications, Westeck and Osteck, were modern constructions by the Todt organisation. But even they were inadequately equipped for defence against attack from the landward side. This, then, was Cherbourg's landward front line, a line which might conceivably be held by crack units, but never by the exhausted remnants of 2 infantry divisions and the medley of men without battle experience. Airfield ground personnel, Luftwaffe transport units, fortification engineers, elderly naval ratings, the office staff of Field Kommandantur No. 583, middle-aged paymasters from the fortress's depot personnel, employees of the Labour Service, the Todt organisation, and Georgian battalions. On May 1, 1944, about 5 weeks before the invasion, General Marx had proved in the course of an exercise that the fortress could be overrun from the landward side. In a surprise attack, the assault battalion Messerschmitt had broken through its defences. It was a piece of tragic irony that the first real enemy penetration was made in exactly the same spot where Marx's assault battalion had broken through in the exercise, at the joint between strong points 422 and 426. The lesson of the manoeuvres had been confirmed by grim reality, and how could it have been otherwise? How could strong points manned by veterinary officers and their staffs, or by half-trained teenage parachutists, stand up to attacks by enemy armour? The line is carved up. What concentrated gunfire and aerial bombardment had failed to achieve was achieved in next to no time by infantry charges with tank support. The men abandoned their positions and sought safety inside the concrete bunkers of the city, but some strong points resisted fanatically. Thus, 18-year-old men of the Labour Service defended their strong point at Gonneville with stubborn courage. The ground was unfavourable, artillery observation was difficult, and the guns could not be brought to bear effectively against the attacking armour. Nevertheless, the young boys stood as firm in their trenches as battle-hardened grenadiers, and even fought the American infantrymen with their spades. But what could they achieve against tanks? They fired their Panzerfaust bazookas while they had any left, and then put up their hands. But even the experienced combat groups were powerless against the Americans, who were equipped with every conceivable technical means. Kiel's men, the 919th Grenadier Regiment from Hesse and Thuringia, the 17th Machine Gun Battalion, and Muller's combat group of the 922nd, none of them were able to stand their ground. Ken's 739th Grenadiers and Rohrbach's 729th likewise had to yield. Thanks to their material superiority, the American assault regiments simply carved up the front. Lieutenant Colonel Kiel reports, "The American attacks on all the strongpoints, however small, invariably followed the same pattern. First, bombing by 50 aircraft, second, pasting by mortar fire, then the charge by assault troops. The Americans carried first-rate walkie-talkie sets, and they reported back immediately on the success or failure of their operation." Before the German company commander was even informed by Runner that the enemy had established himself in one of his strongpoints, the commander of the American assault force would have called up reinforcements by radio. As soon as they had captured a strongpoint, they organized themselves for all-round defense and waited for the German counterattack. They then repulsed it and followed up at once. Hours would pass before regimental headquarters got a clear picture of what was happening and before countermeasures of any scope could even begin to be taken. In the meantime, the same drill would be carried out at some other strongpoint. In this way, at the cost of a colossal expenditure of materiel, the German landward front was being crushed and atomized. General von Schlieben was thinking of his appointment as fortress commander by Hitler on June 23. The Führer had sent him a telegram. It had contained the sentence, "If the worst is to happen, then Cherbourg must fall into enemy hands only as a heap of rubble." A heap of rubble. Schlieben stood gazing at the map. It recorded clearly the unrolling of events. On June 20 at 2 p.m, a signal had come from Artillery Group South. Enemy spearhead on Valogne. Cherbourg Road has reached southern outpost. Request permission to open fire late in the afternoon towards 5:45 p.m. The Americans reached the landward front on the eastern sector also, near the village of Lataille. They probed the German defences but withdrew again when the salvos of 5th and 8th Batteries, 1709th Artillery Regiment crashed down on the armoured spearheads. That had been the overture. The curtain was rung up on the first act on the morning of June 21. An air raid of tremendous force, by several waves of 1,000 machines, battered the German lines. It was followed by concentrated artillery fire, and by attacks from low-flying aircraft. Eventually the tanks rumbled forward. From Saint-Pierre-Église, a detachment advanced cautiously towards the airfield at Gonneville, within the area of strongpoints 410 to 420. Captain Zdralek, in charge of the 9th Battery, acted as artillery observer in strongpoint 416, directing the fire of his guns against the American tanks, direct hit. The tanks turned tails. Presently they came back, intent on forcing the breakthrough this time, but they were again unable to get through the barrage of gunfire. Once more they withdrew, however. They succeeded elsewhere. Alarm. The shout went up in strongpoints 425 and 426. But already the tanks were upon them, having crept up over ground that was difficult to observe. A parachute company composed of young men from a training battalion with only 6 weeks' training and with no fighting experience was overrun. The enemy, as a result, gained a foothold right inside the German lines. True enough, Second Lieutenant Kadau of the 729th Grenadiers succeeded in holding strongpoints, 421 and 424 with his company, but what use was that? The American tanks simply drove through the gap at strongpoint 425 at 4:15 p.m. They were outside the gun position of 2nd Lieutenant Ohlmeyer's 5th Battery, 1061st Artillery Regiment. The regimental battery of the 1709th, under Lieutenant Bauer, had been overrun, and Bauer and most of his gunners had been killed. The position of 11th Battery, under Lieutenant Schwalbe, was defended in furious hand-to-hand fighting. Gun after gun was eliminated by the tanks. The horses in the transport park were mown down. Lieutenant Schwalbe, though wounded, reached the Ostek fort and made his report. Artillery reconnaissance parties of 8th, 10th and 11th Batteries entered the threatened area. They reported back, enemy spearheads with armoured support have already reached the Cherbourg-Taville main road, west of the airfield. Second Lieutenant Cadow is still holding out in the main line, apart from the gap torn into it at strong point 425. The main line is still intact. Captain Walter, with his 8th Battery, 1709th Artillery Regiment, is encircled by the enemy and has organised all-round defence. It was the great hour of the artillery. The infantry's counter-attacks were supported by concentrated gunfire. Every barrel was firing to capacity. As if by a miracle, the field telephone lines to the encircled 8th Battery, running through the switchboard of the overrun regimental battery, had remained intact. The unmanned exchange, with the connections set for fire control, thus continued to function in a sunken lane which had long since been captured by the enemy. "Hang on," was the message the men of 8th Battery heard again and again, and they hung on. Lieutenant Frey, with a battalion of 729th Grenadier Regiment, fought his way right up to the battery in a surprise counter-attack. Corporal Rule knocked out 2 enemy tanks with his Panzerfaust. The Americans opened fire with phosphorus shells, but 8th Battery, encircled from 3 sides, held out. In vain Frey tried to seal off the lost strong points 423 to 425. Captain Holman, repeating the attempt with a parachute company, was no more successful. The danger persisted. For another 3 days, 8th Battery stood its ground. Then the position had to be abandoned. They blew up their guns. The crews by then had been reduced to 22 men, all that was reflected on the situation map in General Schlieben's command post, in straight and curved arrows, in discontinuous and dotted lines, in conventional tactical signs for batteries, regiments, companies, headquarters, and all kinds of units. The great battle was transformed here into an abstract mural, but for anyone who knew how to read it, each line was pregnant with life and death. On June 22nd, the Americans forced deep penetrations into the western and southern parts of the front. By June 23, Major General Collins's assault regiments had driven 4 wedges into the German defences. The main German line collapsed in many places. In the areas of all 4 German combat groups, American tanks were striking at artillery positions, now forced to defend themselves from all directions. On June 24, the enemy had established himself in the suburbs of Tour-la-Ville and Octeville, and at the Fort de Roule. Thus the underground command bunker of Schlieben, Hennecke, and the artillery commander Reiter found themselves within the immediate combat zone. Captain crosses the lines on June 25 towards 10 a.m. A squadron of enemy warships appeared off the fortress, just as if they were taking part in a naval exercise. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, was Cherbourg to be cracked from the sea after all? In the wireless room of Fort Homet, Captain Witt, the harbour commandant, sat behind the vision slits of the concrete bunker which looked almost like the bridge of a cruiser. "Lattice masts," he said, his eyes glued to the telescope that meant battleships of an older American type. Now the fleet opened fire. Out of a wall of smoke and fumes the salvos came roaring over. Not since the Battle of Jutland had Witt seen a squadron in action with all its guns blazing. Fascinated, he watched the spectacle. In any event, that was all he could do. The units were keeping well out of range of his 150mm battery in Fort Homat. The shells churned up the ground, direct hits in the Fort des Flamands. Stocks of ammunition going up, big fires. The squadron sailed up and down in front of the fortress. East of the harbour it came a little closer inshore. Surely Hamburg Battery ought to be able to get them now, Witt was thinking. At the same instant he could see the muzzle flashes. The heavy coastal batteries York, Brommy and Hamburg were firing at the American naval units. York Battery scored hits on Texas, on a light cruiser, and on a destroyer at the Hamburg Battery, Lieutenant Gelbhaar opened up with his 4 240mm guns and scored hits aboard 2 cruisers of the Cumberland class. True, the British Admiralty denied the loss of a cruiser, as assumed on the German side, but there were plenty of witnesses to confirm that highly effective direct hits had been scored, including Army coastal artillery officers, who would certainly be the last persons to credit the naval gunners with any unearned success. According to information released by the United States Navy Department on March 4, 1954, the German batteries engaging in duel with the Allied naval force scored direct hits on His Majesty's ship Glasgow, United States ship Texas, United States ship Bryan, United States ship Barden, and United States ship Laffey. Towards 12 p.m., the Allied squadron withdrew beyond the range of the German coastal batteries. Mass formations of lightning bombers came screaming over to attack the German gun positions. By grid-pattern fire, the naval fortress guns and the flak between them succeeded in shooting down 80 aircraft. An hour later, Schlieben's intelligence officer made a highly significant entry on his situation map. Fort de Roule had fallen. It was obvious at a glance that the approach roads from the south were no longer covered. They were open to the enemy. The town and harbour had become a prize, ready to be plucked by the Americans. Their heavy artillery was pounding the encircled heights of the suburb of Octeville, below which lay the network of subterranean bunkers which housed the German command posts. American engineers were trying to blast these command posts and thus paralyze the nerve centre of the German defence. That was the moment when Schlieben had sent out his urgent signal into the ether, asking the higher command whether there was still any need for the destruction of such forces as remained in Cherbourg. We already know Rommel's reply, logged in at 3:48 p.m. and handed to Schlieben at 3:52 p.m. In accordance with the Führer's orders, you are to continue fighting to the last round. The next few hours were charged with dramatic tension. From the hill came the detonations of the charges intended to blast and block the southern exit gallery. "We ought to blast the Americans off the hilltop, Herr Admiral." Henniker regarded the lieutenant doubtfully. Boldly, the lieutenant continued. "I did the same thing at Saint-Marcouf, and successfully too. It was our only chance. I got our neighbouring battery at Asville to open up at my bunker. Enemy assault troops had got on top of it and were trying to force us out." The man giving the Admiral this somewhat unorthodox advice was Lieutenant Ohmsen. He had been brought to Henniker's headquarters office by Blum, the Admiral's orderly and situation officer. Henniker reflected a while. "Have you still got a line to the Cap de la Hague batteries, Blum?" "Yes, Herr Admiral. Send a signal instructing them to pound our hill with their 250mm long barrel or their 203mm cruiser guns, and inform General von Schlieben." But this time Ohmsen's recipe did not work. The Cap de la Hague batteries had taken a heavy pasting from big-caliber naval guns and aerial bombs. The adjustment of the guns had been upset too much, and the battery commander was afraid of hitting the German defenders. Thus, the Americans were able to carry on undisturbed with their drilling operations on top of the hill of Octeville. Some 2,000 wounded were lying in the hospitals of the compact town. Red Cross signs could not stop the shells. A slightly wounded, captured American captain asked the Medical Corps lieutenant to take him to Schlieben. He offered to cross the lines, to point out the location of the hospitals to the American commander, and to return with medical supplies. Schlieben let him go. Maybe the captain was merely trying to dodge the inferno, but then again, maybe he really would help, and help he did. Towards 5 p.m., the captain returned with a consignment of pain-killing drugs and with a letter from the American commanding general. In it, the general called on Schlieben to surrender. "You and your troops have resisted stubbornly and gallantly, but you are in a hopeless situation. The moment has come for you to capitulate. Send your reply by radio, on a frequency of 320 p.m. kilocycles, and show a white flag or fire white signal flares from the Naval Hospital or the Pasteur Clinic. After that, send a staff officer under a flag of truce to the farmhouse on the road to Fort de Roule to accept the terms of surrender." Schlieben sent word to the captain that he had nothing to reply to the letter. He was playing for time to complete the last big demolitions in the harbour that would rule out the unloading of transports at Cherbourg for many months to come. At exactly 7 p.m., a tremendous tremor ran through the fortress. Captain Witt, the harbour commandant, had blown up the dock railway station in accordance with orders. Piers and jetties were wrecked by 35 tons of dynamite. The old tower, Cherbourg's famous landmark, was also toppled into the harbour basin. Schlieben had hesitated for a long time about blowing up the tower, but military considerations had prevailed in the end. Its masonry would represent an additional complication to the restoration of the harbour basin to normal use, and Cherbourg's famous silhouette had gone. By 7:10 p.m. assault troops of American engineers with flamethrowers and bunker demolition charges had got to within 100 yards of the northern exits of the underground headquarters galleries. The general gave orders for all secret papers to be burnt, At 19:32, his orderly officer, Lieutenant Krusp, dispatched the last signal. Last phase of fighting begun. General fighting side by side with his men, 7th Army bombastically replied, "We are with you," and Schlieffen could only smile resignedly as he read the signal. Octeville surrenders. The underground galleries were chock-full with troops who had gained the safety of the bunker. They were utterly finished and were waiting for the end. Only corporals and sergeants were still pushing their way through the galleries, lugging ammunition boxes to the exits where the commanding officers and their staffs were resisting with carbines, machine pistols and machine guns in accordance with the order. To the last round. As Sub-Lieutenant Bloom opened the steel door to the hospital gallery, he was met by a stench that nearly took his breath away. Ursula Brautigam, his efficient auxiliary, almost collided with him. She was helping in the hospital. At night she still kept the operations low. "How are things here, Ursula?" Bloom asked. The girl made a resigned gesture. 300 men crammed tight in the gallery, and what's worse, they've been dying off like flies since yesterday. "Why?" Bloom inquired. Ursula Brautigam shrugged her shoulders. "Better ask the chief medical officer." A surgeon ensign was coming along with blood transfusion equipment. Bloom asked him, "Do you know where the chief is?" "He's been operating for the past 5 hours. The young doctor was anxious to get along, but Bloom held him. "Why are the men dying? Because the ventilation's packed up. The wounded are simply being poisoned. They are dying because the air is poor in oxygen, but full of gases and cordite fumes that have come down through the ventilation shafts from the demolitions and the explosions. And what can be done about it?" "Nothing," replied the doctor. "Even gas masks would be useless." Bloom returned to the exit of the right-hand northern gallery, where Schlieffen and Henneker, armed with carbines, were standing behind improvised breastworks. The Americans had just started lobbing mortar shells at the concrete canopy above the gallery exits. The sub-lieutenant reported on the situation in the hospital. The two commanders withdrew a few steps down the gallery. They were talking, and the others could hear the word "orders," and then Schlieffen's voice clearly, "If my superiors thought fit to make me a general, then they've got to accept the fact that I will act in accordance with the situation and with my conscience." This was not the first time that Karl Wilhelm von Schlieffen had behaved in this way. In July 1943, while commanding the 18th Panzer Division in Russia, he had led his troops out of encirclement to freedom by defying orders. Now he was determined to save at least the bare lives of his men. Then the words "flag of truce" were heard. The news spread through the galleries like wildfire. "The old man is sending off an officer under a flag of truce. He's putting an end to it," and it was like a great sigh of relief. As the white sheet tied to a rifle was held out of the bunker entrance, the enemy fire fell silent. It was a terrifying silence that was suddenly brooding over the tormented town. 2 officers walked out with the white flag. The time was a little after 2 p.m. on June 26. The battle for the nerve centre of the fortress of Cherbourg was over. The hillside spewed out a long stream of soldiers, sailors, officers, and administrative officials. Schlieffen and Henneker were taken over by American officers at the exit of the gallery and conducted to General Eddy, the commander of the 9th United States Division, on top of the hill of Octeville. Eddy drove off with the 2 Germans to General Collins's Corps headquarters, 19 miles south of Cherbourg. The photographers were already lined up, cameras clicked, and presently thousands of copies of the picture were dropped by enemy propaganda units over the lines where the Germans were still resisting. That, too, was a part of modern warfare. Meanwhile, an interesting argument was taking place behind the scenes. A number of American officers suggested to First Army that General Bradley should invite Schlieffen to supper. There was much argument in favor and against at United States headquarters. In the end, Bradley himself settled the issue with typically American logic. "If Schlieffen had surrendered 4 days earlier, I'd have asked him. But now that he has cost us a pile of human lives, no, well, Bradley was to have a good deal more annoyance from similar characters before he was through with them." As far as the troops and the regimental officers were concerned, there was no argument among the Americans about asking them to dinner. The loudspeakers blared, "Keep moving," and the GIs shouted, "Max Snell, Ursula Brautigam, the Padre, and Frau Wist," the same Frau Wist who had given a recital in the Cherbourg officers' mess on June 5, were loaded on a lorry and subsequently exchanged for British nurses in German captivity. Sub-Lieutenant Blum, Lieutenant Kruspe, and Corporal Kroner from Sand near Kassel were taken from the prisoner of war collection point and packed into a jeep. Their destination was United States headquarters at Yvetot. To join Schlieffen and Hennecke, off they went, heavily guarded like dangerous criminals. An American sergeant was sitting on the edge of the jeep, his finger on the trigger of his Tommy gun. "Look at the road they're taking us," exclaimed Kruspe, and Blum looked round. Then, in his best school English, he said to the escort officer, who was sitting next to the driver, "You are driving along a mined road." The American snarled with bad words. The bang occurred almost instantaneously. They had hit a mine. The shock and the jolt caused the sergeant to squeeze the trigger. The burst of fire killed the two Americans, and the German corporal, the sergeant himself, had his belly ripped open by a splinter. Only Kruspe and Blum got away with their lives. Though heavily wounded, Blum had a Tommy gun bullet in his head. The fall of Octeville, of course, did not mean that the whole of the large town and harbour were in American hands. Schlieffen had expressly surrendered only his own headquarters. The commanders of the various districts, especially in the strongly fortified arsenal, had to make their own decisions. They all knew that what mattered most was to gain time. It was obvious, however, that any prolonged resistance was out of the question. Panic was rife. The fighting morale nearly everywhere was at zero. True, behind the ramparts of the naval arsenal, there were still strong and effective units under Major General Sattler, the town commandant. But unlike Captain Witt, the harbour commandant Sattler did not believe in further resistance. He surrendered on the morning of June 27, and, together with 400 men, was taken into captivity. Captain Witt, on the other hand, did not give up yet. He ordered a labour service unit to seal off the rampart along the dock basin, personally saw to the last demolitions, and, on the receding tide, with 8 officers and 30 other ranks, crossed to the fortifications on the outer mole in a yacht and 2 dinghies. There, at Fort West, was the firing panel for the still intact minefields off the big Western Harbour entrance. Whoever had his finger on the button there could block the entrance. Naval Group West in Paris were considerably surprised when they received a signal as late as June 27, battle headquarters of Harbour Commandant now at Fort West. Mine detonation panel ready for action. Back came an astonished signal from Paris. How was move made to Fort West? Laconically, Witt replied, "Aboard yacht and 2 dinghies at first light." The captain could not have foreseen that this exchange of signals would provide the material for a heroic broadcast account of his exploit. It was a stirring tale. Its only weakness was that the Americans monitored it. General Collins, whose lightning victories scored with his 25th United States Division over the Japanese had earned him the flattering nickname of Lightning Joe, was already furious at the delay of his Cherbourg operation. His reputation was beginning to suffer. He could not afford any heroics by German centres of resistance. The battle against Witt became a matter of prestige for him. Nevertheless, it took the Americans 3 days to subdue the fortifications on the outer mole by artillery and aerial bombardment. Only when the mine detonation panel in Fort West had been smashed by concrete-piercing shells did Witt, now wounded, give in. On the western sector of the Cherbourg front, in the Communications Peninsula, so called because of the numerous pieces of telecommunication equipment installed there by the Navy and the Luftwaffe for the observation of the English south coast, resistance also continued for some time. The units involved there were the Combat Group Kyle with the regimental headquarters and 2nd Battalion, 919th Grenadier Regiment, the Assault Battalion Messerschmitt, and the 17th Machine Gun Battalion. Artillery support was provided by the Artillery Group West under Major Quitnut and the light flak gunners of the 932nd.